Wow, these lights are bright. Man. I'm Bob Boisture, and I am incredibly grateful to be here with two dear friends and truly inspiring leaders. I am, as Sarah said, president of the Fetzer Institute. First thing I want to do is a loud amen to all of the expressions of gratitude that we've just heard and have heard across the week. We at Fetzer are really grateful, deeply grateful to be able to do a small part in supporting this amazing gathering, but even more amazing community that gathers here. I want to particularly recognize, although I can't see her, my colleague Jillian Ganda, who is our Director of Engagement and is our point person in this beautiful relationship with the festival. So Jillian, wherever you are, thank you. We have an incredible treat here this afternoon to hear two truly inspiring leaders, both of whom Fetzer is honored to be able to work with and support, and that I'm now honored to be able to call friends, Richie Davidson and Lisa Miller. They are both that amazing blend of pioneering scientists in their respective fields and passionate advocates for this vision of spiritual renewal, both for us individually and for us as a human family, and have spent their whole careers all in on both the science and the vision for spiritual renewal. Richie, as many of you know already, starting in the early 1970s, has been one of the leading pioneers in studying the neuroscience of emotion, but beyond emotion, of spiritual transformation, how spiritual practice can literally rewire our brains in ways that help us bring love and connection and compassion into the world. Tremendously gifted academic entrepreneur who has willed into existence at the University of Wisconsin the Center on Healthy Minds, an amazing and amazingly powerful set of people really putting wheels under this vision, a close colleague and dear friend for many years of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and just a beautiful person. So Richie, thank you. And I could say many of the same things about Lisa, a pioneer in really creating a field within psychology, studying the critical importance of spiritual development of children and adolescents in their lifelong flourishing, has created an institute on spirituality, mind, and body at Teachers College at Columbia, has a wonderful book that if you haven't read it, you should, called The Spiritual Child, and is, with the activist side of her life, pioneering the formation of a grassroots movement across the country to reinfuse spirituality into education. So two really inspiring leaders. The batting order is going to be Richie and then Lisa. So Richie, without anything further, invite you to kick us off.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to stand for this because I'm going to use a few slides. And first, let me express my gratitude to Bob for his visionary leadership of the Fetzer Institute, which is playing such an important role in the promotion of spiritual values and inserting the very word love back into discourse in the academy and particularly in science. And I love that you use the word love. And Vivek Murthy, if those of you heard him yesterday, our former Surgeon General, also talked about this epic conflict between love and fear, and how this festival is really so much an invitation for us to embrace love. And it's just wonderful to be among such supporters and activists who are helping to promote these values. So I'm going to today give you a little glimpse of what we have been spending quite a bit of time and energy on over the last number of years, and it really is captured in the title of this presentation. Everything else is a footnote, and the title is Well-Being as a Skill. And most people don't think of well-being as a skill, but hopefully all of you will appreciate this invitation to reconceptualize well-being as a skill. I am a neuroscientist by training. I began my career with one simple question, and that is, why is it that some people are more vulnerable to life's slings and arrows and others more resilient? And how can we nurture this quality and promote more human flourishing to promote more resilience? And in the early part of my career, I focused a lot on the adversity side, studying the neural basis of how we respond to stress and anxiety. And then in 1992, I met this gentleman who is here. He is visiting. In this photograph is a picture that was taken in 2001. He was visiting our lab at the University of Wisconsin. This is His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He actually has visited Madison, not to brag about this, but he's visited Madison 16 times. We are so blessed that it really is quite extraordinary. And he has been such an inspiration. And when I first met him in 1992, he challenged me and he said, look, you've been using tools of modern science to study anxiety and fear and depression and stress. Why can't you use those same tools to study kindness and compassion? And that was a wake-up call. And then a few years later, another meeting, he was more explicit, and he said, I want you to take the practices from our tradition, turn them into a form which can be enjoyed by everyone, a more secular form, not losing the spiritual quality. Investigate them with tools of modern science, and if you find them to be valuable, disseminate them widely. And this is my assignment for the remainder of my life. And this is what we've been doing. And so I'd like to share with you a little bit about this journey. And one of the most important things that I want to say at the beginning is that this work that we and other scientists are doing could not have been done were it not for a number of critical developments in modern science that provide the basis and the framework and the foundation for all of this work. And I'd like to give you a glimpse of what that is. And I'd like to talk about 4 themes. The first is neuroplasticity. I'm sure many of you have heard this word before. Neuroplasticity happens wittingly or unwittingly. Our brains are constantly being shaped by experience. Our brains are being shaped by forces around us about which we often have little control, and also frequently, if not most of the time, are unaware of. And the invitation in all of this work is that we can all take more responsibility for our own brains. And one of the amazing discoveries that scientists have made is that by nurturing virtuous qualities of mind, we actually can promote positive changes in the brain. So this is something that can't be overestimated as really important. When human beings evolved on this planet, we did not all begin brushing our teeth. Yet, I know that every one of you sitting here brushes your teeth, probably a few times a day. This is a kind of personal physical hygiene. If we took our minds as seriously as we take our teeth, and if we nurtured our minds, even for these few minutes a day in an intentional way, I have the strong conviction that this world would be a different place. And so I would... I would like you all to be part of this journey and to make a commitment to spend as much time, at least, nurturing your mind as you do brushing your teeth. And really, the data show that even a few minutes a day can make a difference. Now, it turns out that this plasticity is not only present in our brain, it is also present in our genes. The field of epigenetics is the science of how genes are regulated. And we know that we're all born with a fixed complement of base pairs, which is our DNA, and for the most part, that will not change over the course of your lifetime. But what will change is the extent to which a gene is turned on or turned off. You can think of genes having little volume controls. And that is very dynamically regulated. And it turns out that our demeanor actually can influence our gene expression, our epigenetics. The way a mother behaves toward her infant, the extent to which she expresses love and nurturance, can induce epigenetic changes in the infant which will persist for the entire life of the infant, influence its brain wiring and its behavior. And it turns out from modern new research over the last few years, those changes can be passed down at least a couple of generations. And this is not fringe science. This stuff is published in the very best scientific journals in the world. And this is very powerful and suggests that our quality of mind, the embodiment of virtue, is something that is cellular and will impact all of these different levels of our mind and our body. The third theme is related to this, and that is our increased understanding of the bidirectional communication between the mind and brain and the body. Our minds are embodied. And it turns out that when we nurture positive qualities of our mind, it doesn't only influence our psychological well-being. It actually influences our biology below the neck in ways which are consequential for health. Large epidemiological studies show that individuals who report higher levels of well-being are physically healthier. It does not mean that this is true of everyone. There will, of course, be exceptions, but if you look at tens of thousands of people, this is what you see. And so it leads to the conjecture that promoting well-being will actually change our systemic biology, which will influence our physical health. And so one of the implications of this is cultivating well-being will lead to decreased healthcare utilization and decreased healthcare costs. And if we can actually show that, every organization on the planet will want to incorporate this into what they are doing. And so this is actually something that Mayor Gregg and I were talking about as an opportunity to explore here in Louisville with a number of different sectors that I think will be receptive to this. The fourth theme is something I mentioned this morning for those who were in the practice that we did together. And of all the four themes I'm going to talk about, this is probably the most controversial. But I think also it is one that is very powerful and has extraordinarily important implications. And that is that every human being comes into the world with innate basic goodness. Now, since this is the most controversial, let me just give you one little data point of how scientists explore this. And I'm going to show you two very short video clips that were shown to 6-month-old babies. So let me show you these video clips. Okay, that's one. Which of these do you think a 6-month-old baby prefers? How do you know that? How can we ask a 6-month-old baby which it prefers? One way is we can look at the extent to which the baby smiles. And it turns out that babies smile much more to the first clip than compared to the second clip. Also, scientists can monitor the eye movements of these babies, can look using infrared eye tracking precisely at where and for how long a baby is looking. And it turns out that more than 90% of infants prefer to look at the first video compared to the second video. They show more gaze fixation toward the first compared to the second. Now, this is part of a large corpus of literature that is growing that all points in the same direction. And it suggests that qualities like kindness and altruism are there from the start. But we think of kindness in a way that is similar to the way scientists think of language. We're all born with a propensity for language. But in order for that propensity to be expressed, it needs to be nurtured. We need to be raised in a normal linguistic community, and it may well be the same for kindness, that we all come into the world with these seeds of kindness. And the reason why this is particularly important is we do practices to nurture these qualities, and when we do that, we're not creating these qualities de novo, out of nowhere, but rather we are nurturing a basic characteristic of our mind that all human beings share. So, from this background and this foundation, we have formulated a framework for understanding well-being that is deeply informed by both the contemplative traditions and by modern science. And this is a framework that holds that well-being is comprised of 4 major constituents, and each of these constituents or components shows plasticity. We can actually cultivate these qualities. So in the remainder of the few minutes I have, I'm going to quickly go through each of these 4 qualities and say a little bit about them. But before I do that, let me just say that there is an urgent need. This is not a luxury, but I think that the data is pointing us in the direction of saying that this is a necessity. There's a lot of data we can show, but let me just give you a couple of tidbits. This is the percentage of youth in the United States between the ages of 12 and 17 who experienced a major depression in the past year, and the data go from 2004 to 2015. And you can see on the left there are different age groups, and you can see among kids 16 to 17, more than 15% of the population is experiencing this is a diagnosable major depression. And you can also see in the figure on the right the gender difference. These differences are profoundly different in boys and girls, with girls suffering from at the rate of about twice what boys suffer. And that gender difference emerges right around adolescence and persists that way for the remainder of life. And these differences are present in every Western country in which this has been investigated. If you look at suicides in adolescence, what we see is that this graph is going, unfortunately, in the wrong direction. So this is the bad news. But when Martin Luther King gave his famous speech in the 60s, the title of that speech was not "I Have a Nightmare." So we can have a vision, a dream of what is possible. And so I'm going to skip that and just underscore that well-being is an urgent public health need. And the 4 components of well-being are these. The first component we call awareness. And it includes mindfulness. It includes self-awareness. Meta-awareness is the quality of knowing what our mind is doing, which may sound strange, but how many of us have had the experience of reading a book where you are actually reading each word on a page, and then you turn to another page and maybe a third page, and after that you realize you have absolutely no idea what you've just read. Your mind is somewhere else. Well, it turns out, in a famous study that was done a few years ago, querying people with texts on a smartphone, people were asked 3 questions. One is, what are you doing right now? Checking off from a list of activities. The second question is, where is your mind right now? And the third question was, right at this moment, how happy or unhappy are you? It turns out that 47% of the time, the average American adult is not paying attention to what she or he is doing. 47% of the time. And folks, I have the strong conviction that we could do better. Excuse me. And imagine a world where we can show up and be more fully present. So awareness is a critical ingredient in that. And when people were asked how happy or unhappy are you, when they were distracted, they were significantly less happy. The title of this scientific paper was "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." The second component of well-being is connection. This refers to the qualities that promote successful social relationships. Qualities like kindness, empathy, having a positive outlook. And again, these are qualities that can be cultivated. In research that we've recently done with teachers, where we've trained them in these qualities, we found that measures of implicit bias, which are the driving force of the achievement gap in the United States today, can be significantly reduced. So this is of great practical import. The third component we call insight, and it really is insight into ourselves, into how this narrative that we all carry around about ourselves, how it works. When we become really fixed on this narrative, when it becomes rigid, we become less resilient. At the very extreme, there are people who have a narrative that is filled with negative self-beliefs, and they actually believe the narrative. And that is a prescription for depression. And so part of well-being is cultivating a healthy relationship to this narrative. Finally, the last component of well-being is purpose. Having a clear direction, a true north toward which our life is directed. And most importantly, appreciating how everyday tasks, including stuff like taking out the garbage or doing your laundry, is actually related to your sense of purpose. And it turns out that among people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, sense of purpose is the single most important psychological predictor of longevity. So it actually has real biological significance. So these are 4 components of well-being that each can be nurtured. We know a little bit about how to do that. Different people may require different kinds of strategies, and this is a major area of future scientific research. But this all leads us to the inevitable conclusion that well-being can actually be cultivated. I want to end now with a quote from a book that was on the bestseller list for some time, that was written by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And he said, the systematic training of the mind, the cultivation of happiness, the genuine inner transformation by deliberately selecting and focusing on positive mental states and challenging negative mental states is possible because of the very structure and function of the brain. But the wiring in our brains is not static, not irrevocably fixed. Our brains are also adaptable. Thank you very much.
Richie, thank you very much for a deeply scientifically grounded and very hopeful vision. I'm going to invite Lisa, if you have any reflections that came up for you while Richie was talking.
It's a beautiful talk. Thank you.
Thank you,
Fantastic talk. So if we were to go home this evening and do two things, what might they be?
I would say that one of the important things is to reflect on, with a sense of appreciation, on people that have done things that are helpful to us. We spend so little time intentionally appreciating what others do to help us in our life tasks. And appreciation, I think, is an emotion which is insufficiently appreciated. And so I think that that can be really, really helpful. And a second is to recognize that calming our minds and opening our hearts is not just good for us, but really can be beneficial to all of those around us. And so we can do very simple practices to help ground us and make us calmer by bringing our awareness into our bodies and into the present moment. It's something that just requires a little bit of practice.
So you underscored the urgency of this task. So let's reverse engineer. If we have a decade or 2 decades to really infuse this understanding into our culture, where are the most important places to start?
I think the leverage, it's a great question, and thank you for asking it, Bob. I think the leverage points, in my view, are one is the business community, actually. I have found, I've been an academic my whole life. I must tell you that I found more receptivity in the corporate world to this than I found among colleagues in the academy.
That's extraordinary.
I think that to some extent they are appreciating the importance of collaboration and teamwork. This is something so critical in modern corporate settings. They also are burdened with healthcare costs, and that's a sort of financial issue. So I think the workplace in that sector is one really important sector. Another really important sector is healthcare directly. There is more and more appreciation of this. The American Heart Association came out with a consensus statement that was published in the major cardiac journal Circulation, which is the journal of their association. I believe it was 2018, a consensus statement on the utility of contemplative practice as an adjunct treatment for cardiovascular disease. So it's beginning to happen. And I would say the third major area is education, and there's here in Louisville with the Compassionate School project that is so central to this city and is a wonderful example of how these kinds of practices can be infused in an education system at a large scale.
Well, that's a wonderful lead into Lisa, whose work, of course, focuses on exactly that. So let's invite Lisa, you to come, and we'll have a chance to come back to this conversation at the end. So thank you.
Thanks. I want to say thank you, Louisville. You've been extraordinary hosts. I've had the opportunity to spend 3 days with you, and it is clear that you are an inspired city. This is a spiritual city. And sitting here amongst you, you can feel the great oneness that holds you. So thank you very much for your hospitality. And Fetzer, Bob, thank you. You have been courageous, first out of the blocks in many culture-changing initiatives. Your lead foot is always the truth, and we're grateful for that. I am wondering who here is a grandparent. Fantastic. And who here is, and there'll be some overlap, of course, a parent. Yes, yes. How about a teacher, counselor, or youth leader? Fantastic. So you have had the blessing, the gift of being witness to a spiritual child? Actually, show your hands there. Yes. And I'm going to share with you a story of one who came into our lives. Many years ago, although it's gone in a flash, my husband and I, after a road of trials, found our spiritual child. He was beautiful, he was soulful, he was in a little crib north of St. Petersburg, Russia, in a tiny town. We're getting very close to the North Pole there. And upon seeing us, he looked up and his eyes said, "Da, yes." And that is our boy, Isaiah. And Isaiah came home, and from the get-go, we wanted him to know the great gift that he is to us. As anyone knows who's traveled the world to find your spiritual child, whether it's down the block or many countries away, it is a pilgrimage. It is a sacred pilgrimage, like going to Mecca or Jerusalem. It is a very sacred quest. And we wanted him to know just that. And so starting from the time he was very young, we said, "Isaiah, let's tell the story of finding Isaiah." And he loved this story. We'd say, Isaiah, Grandpa prayed for Isaiah, and Grandma prayed for Isaiah, and Daddy and Mommy prayed for Isaiah. Everybody prayed for Isaiah. But then we took, I think 18 months, a train to a plane, to an automobile. And we jumped out of the automobile and we ran up the hill, and there was Isaiah. And we'd throw him in the air, and it was the Finding Isaiah celebration. He loved this. Until it got a little old, he set Thomas the train aside, and the locomotion was no longer arresting to him. And we moved on to a story that gripped him dearly, which was Isaiah loved nature. Isaiah played in the river. Isaiah loved the geese and the ducks. And so we said, "Isaiah," now he's about 4, "you are our baby Moses. You came down the river to us. You're our special baby Moses." And he would say, "Yes, I am baby Moses." Fast forward, Isaiah's now 8. And I'm driving along, and as grandparents and parents and youth leaders, you know where everything happens when you're driving along. Right? It's the back seat, and I hear psh, 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 psh. Seated with his best buddy, he says, "Mama, Johnny says you are not my mother. My name is not Miller, and I am not Jewish." And I said, "But Isaiah," big breath, "don't you remember?" And he's like, "Oh, yes." And he whips around to his best buddy, and he says, "I am baby Moses." And his friend, unfamiliar with the story, said, "What?" And he said, "I'm baby Moses." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Never mind," by which he meant, you simply just don't understand. But then it got a little tougher. And I was faced with a challenge I'd not anticipated. "Mama, Johnny says someone gave me up. Why'd that woman give me up?" And here I have very dear friends who never found a good answer to that question. So I took a big breath and another big breath, and then I heard, "Oh, I know. God whispered in her ear and said that you were crying for me." The child is a knower. Right? Your child is a knower. And when we share the journey through life as a sacred journey, knowing the turns and the twists from a spiritual perspective, the child is equipped to do the same when faced with the big questions and the tough moments in life. I share with you the story of Isaiah as a form of witness. Right? As a scientist, when we look at a chorus of children or a chorus of parents and families, that is another form of witness. Right? And so I'll share with you 3 major sets of findings that we now have from over 20 years of very good, top-shelf, peer-reviewed science that sheds light on stories such as this, perhaps in your own home or your own faith community or your own school, that the child is indeed, from day one, a spiritual child. That if we support this deep capacity, they are fortified in developing a powerful spiritual core. And that when we do this together, there is nothing as parents, grandparents, teachers, counselors, and youth leaders we can do as profoundly protective against the greatest forms of suffering and foundational to thriving in our children's lives. So let's take the first point. The child is a spiritual child. How do we know that? Through the lens of science, we can determine whether any trait is innate or socialized. IQ is about half and half innate, half socialized. Temperament is about 60% innate, which, as people who know children, you know well. No two babies come out alike. The capacity through which we experience spiritual life, within or without of a faith tradition, across all faith traditions, the deep, innate capacity through which we experience the sacred, the transcendent awareness is 1/3 socialized, 1/3 innate, 2/3 socialized, which means 1/3 innate, every one of us is born a spiritual child. 2/3 socialized, you have an enormous impact on the cultivation of the spiritual core. How we live our lives side by side, our children, determines what, by the time they are 18, the world will look like. Will they look with an open heart onto a foundationally spiritual world, or will they feel isolated and separated in a meaningless universe? That is in our hands. Every child is born a spiritual child. Finding two, with puberty, biological puberty, this capacity surges. And this you know well. What is my meaning? What is my purpose? Actually, what is the meaning, the purpose? Perhaps there's none. And if we take that seriously, the felt sense that maybe in the developmental path there's a window where we don't know if there's meaning, we have nothing but the deepest respect for supporting spiritual growth through puberty. How do we know that? With biological puberty is a 50% increase in the heritable contribution to spiritual life. Finding three, when we support innate spiritual development in adolescence, the spiritual core is formed that is integrated with all other lines of development. So moral choices are not cherry-picked, but rather derived from a deep sense of connection to the higher power, God, Allah, Hashem, the universe, nature, the deep source of life in us, through us, and around us. When that happens, the protective benefits against the most prevalent forms of suffering are greater than that known by any other factor in clinical or social sciences. A teen who says, I turn to God for guidance in times of difficulty. Nature is a sacred home. My family carries deep spiritual meaning to me. That teen is 80% less likely to become addicted to substances as compared to a teen who says, I don't know what you're talking about. Right? That teen is 60% less likely to have recurrent major depression. Every teen gets depressed, but the potholes in life that derail us and take us from otherwise normative development can be prevented by building the spiritual core. Why? Ken Kendler and his team found that with each successive little depressive episode, the trip cord gets lower. So if I am broken up with, if I fail a test, I have a choice about what to make of that. And I can say, you know what? I am such a loser. Nobody likes me. Right? That type of attribution, that type of thinking sets me up to really be even more depressed next time. But if I say, you know what? I can learn from this. There's a path here. And facing a major loss, if I can say, I know God walks by my side. There is a meaning to this diversion in my path that I didn't expect that will open another door. If I can cultivate a spiritual response to big losses and suffering, then rather than developing a lower trip cord to the next unfortunate and unwanted event, I actually build, much by way of metaphor, my muscle to handle the heavier load in life. Right? So what do we know? Every child's a spiritual child. With puberty, there's a surge, an extraordinary opportunity to fortify this natural capacity. And if we do, there is nothing in the clinical or social sciences as profoundly protective against anxiety, depression, substance abuse. We face an epidemic of suicide. I've been invited to Palo Alto. Well, there's now a train track that is barriered from the street with a fence. Because if you can delay for 2 minutes a teen from taking his or her life, they're unlikely to do it. Right? To Rye, New York, there's a host of communities that are taking back their culture. They're taking back their school culture, their parent culture, and they're infusing it with the deep form of awareness, what we're calling an awakened awareness, a connectivity and a support for this innate spiritual core in every child that will prevent those children from facing the abyss without a spiritual response. And this is in our hands, 2/3 socialized. Now, who are we? Let's stand over here. That's our spiritual child. Who are we, and how do we do this work? It's not by picking up 4 different books on religion and philosophy in college that a child awakens necessarily to the spiritual path. And in fact, what college counselors tell me is 2/3 of my caseload is not psychopathology. It's unsupported struggle. It's existential emptiness without a spiritual response, without the deep inner core there to handle life. Well, the data is quite clear that in making the spiritual child, that is the 2/3 socialized part of the spiritual child, there's an equal contribution from our own transparency on our spiritual path by their side, and from our embodiment as parents, grandparents, educators, and youth leaders, our embodiment of spiritual values, love, unconditional love, seeing you truly for who you are, not as an A or a C, not as my kid who just won the game or just was benched, but seeing you more deeply as a soul on earth, as a child of infinite worth. Our embodiment of spiritual values plus our transparency creates the lived ecology of harvesting this natural gift, the innate spirituality. So what does this look like? I'll give you an example. I had a deeply religious and spiritual mother who prayed out loud, who would cry and say how beautiful the sunset, what a gift from God. Thank you, God, for my children, as she'd look at each of us, and tears would come to her eyes as she would pray and view every single moment of life as a sacred event. And I had an equally loving, as equally powerfully an embodiment of spiritual values in my father, who was quite a skeptic and would read plays on the back porch, a professor of the performing arts. But it was my father who, on the very day after his mother passed, on the awakening very early that morning at about 5 a.m., came down, sat by my side on the carpet, and said, you know, in a very raw and unmetabolized way, Grandma, she came to me last night in my dream. It'd been one day. And Grandma loved to dress up. She wore beautiful clothes and pretty jewelry, but in this dream, said my father, Grandma was wearing an everyday gray suit. And she was walking by my side down Grand Avenue in Des Moines, Iowa, where my father had grown up with his mother. And he said, you know, I take this to mean that Grandma had always walked by my side. She would always be my mother and continue to walk by my side, that Grandma is with me. It was pure and clear. And to this day, that is the register of my relationship with my father. And to this day, I am certain that our ancestors walk with us, not because of my 20 years of the scientific look, but because deep in my knowing, in my inner wisdom, my father told me so. Right? This is who we are. There is no one in the world who can take your place in supporting our spiritual children. Now, we do not need to be perfect, and I will be the first to say, I, as a parent, am very full of love and very full of error. And still, this can be fixed. So if I were to take an example of transparency and embodiment brought to a not-so-bright moment, here with you, very gracious people, I will give a modest example. I'm driving along in a grumpy mood, honking at traffic, perhaps discourteous, which is more embarrassing to the barista at Starbucks. I've been really grumpy and not so good today, right? And the worst part of all is I've basically ignored the back seat. So at the end of the day, the sun is setting, and I look back, and I pull over, and I say, you know, Mommy's sorry, because really, you're the most important thing in my life, and I feel that I wasn't really present today, so I want to apologize to you. I'm trying to fix it, human to human. And then, the great presence in us, through us, and around us. Will you join me in a prayer or a meditation or a walk in nature where we thank God for today? And I would like to ask for forgiveness, because today was a gift, and I think I squandered it. And in this moment, the child knows that things can be fixed, not just between us, but in the sacred journey we share side by side. And if they can fix that, they can fix the losses and the pains that come and put us at risk for anxiety, depression, and substance abuse, even suicide. There is a spiritual response, and we teach it on the road of life, side by side. So this is who we are. This is our great honor. And ultimately, what would the science say? We are ambassadors. So thank you.
Richie, I'm thinking there are profound connections between your work and Lisa's.
Yes.
I wondered if you might like to reflect on that.
Sure. First, thank you for bringing awareness to this dimension of child development that has been, I think, impoverished in the academy until your work came along. And so calling attention to it, I think, is really the first important thing to do to help nourish these qualities. I love the framework that you develop in thinking about the nurturing of spiritual qualities as really something that can be done upstream, a kind of preventative strategy to promote a kind of developmental trajectory that will buffer a child from the kind of adversities that children face these days with bullying, substance abuse, those kinds of issues. And I think that this is something that where there's correlational evidence, and I think now we're poised to begin to actually develop even stronger kind of evidence where spiritual qualities can be promoted in children to then see what the prophylactic effect of that development is as the children age, as the children develop in longitudinal studies. And so I think that this is really an exciting and vibrant area which I'm just grateful to you, Lisa, for bringing attention to. So thank you.
Yes, a big thank you for a wonderful presentation. All of us, I know, are familiar with the broad-scale adoption by schools, public and private, of the idea of social and emotional learning. And what I'm beginning to hear on a number of fronts is that that field has reached a point where there's an openness to going deeper, and maybe it becomes social, emotional, and spiritual learning. Do you see that possibility?
It's a wonderful point. Beautiful, really culture-changing work has indeed been done by character ed and social emotional learning. Beautiful work. And we are hearing from colleagues, hey, would you like to join us? We see a desire and need to go deeper. The spiritual core makes immediate sense to people. Sometimes to do this in a way that is inclusive and constitutional, we might speak of the awakened core. And there's enormous hunger and interest. So we took the approach at Teachers College and working together with you and many schools across the country that master educators who've spent thousands of hours in aggregate trying to support this core, who oftentimes went into education feeling called to support the deep core of the child, already had some answers. And with your tremendous help, we engaged in 2 years of field study. We got out of our basic science lab where we knew where all the gadgets were, and we went into the field and really bared witness to how master educators were setting the culture and the climate of their schools. What were they doing to support the natural spirituality in children? And we found, whether we were looking in a public school, a private school, an under-resourced school, a highly resourced school, schools of all different ethnicities, there were at least 8 common dimensions that we were able to distill. Among them, a language to describe inner life and our relationship to the greater field of life, practices of awareness and connection. There was a view of each day as we come here, what are we doing? Are we teaching math? Are we teaching the child? Right? Loving and seeing that child to the core. Those are examples of deep, deliberate acts of culture and climate that a school can adopt. And we're now working with the Collaborative for Spirituality and Education to join with interested schools who want to be part of a self-reflection and transformation process along those axes.
Yeah, it's tremendously important, exciting work, and we'll come back to it later in our conversation. But before we move on, I want to do a shout out to 2 Louisvillians who have been critical in supporting your effort, Frank Peabody and David Woods. I know you're out there. I think you're out there. And I think we're always looking around for matches that are made in heaven and need to be consummated. And I think the connection between your work and the Compassionate Schools Initiative here is so clear that I hope you all can find a way to come together.
We'd be delighted. That's beautiful work going on here in Louisville.
So I'm going to metaphorically change hats here. I get to step out of my moderator role briefly to a presenter role, so I'll stand up and button my jacket to make it official. And I want to do 2 things at the beginning of the week. And the first of his many gracious acknowledgments, Owsley said that at least vis-a-vis this community, Fetzer was a bit below the radar. So I want to come up above the radar and share with you briefly a little bit about who we are and why we're so excited about what's happening here. And then I want to shift gears and say we're not only a community, but we're part of a movement. And we're looking ahead to celebrating the first 25 years of the Festival of Faith, but it's critical that we look beyond to say, what's the next 25 years? And so I just want to share in the second half of my remarks some thoughts that have come up to me that I just want to plant as seeds for thought. So Fetzer, we think we're a special place. There's one respect in which I know we're absolutely unique. We are the only foundation, I'd even say in the world, that has a World Series trophy in our lobby, okay? Which is an opening to say a little bit about John Fetzer. Born in 1901, died in 1991, so he lived in every decade of the 20th century. If you knew him publicly, you would have known him as a very hard-driving and successful entrepreneur, pioneer in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in the early days of radio and television. And then in 1958, he bought the Detroit Tigers and owned them for about 30 years and was a pioneer in the integration of broadcasting in professional sports. But if you'd known him privately and intimately, you would know that his lifelong passion, consuming passion, was the spiritual journey and inner transformation, not only his own, but humanity's. So as he came to the end of his life, he felt a growing conviction that he was to commit his resources to endow a community, not an organization, but a community that could do its small part in building a movement that could support humanity in the next big step in our shared spiritual journey. And so that's who Fetzer is. And the beautiful thing about John Fetzer is he thought that as long-term work, and he didn't know what what that meant. So rather than being highly prescriptive, he said, listen for the ring of truth. And there you, the community, will discover the final work of the foundation. The only thing I'm sure of is that its summary will be unconditional love. How's that for a generosity of spirit? So needless to say, that's a daunting challenge to live into. We've been, as a community, living into it intensely now for almost 30 years. Several milestones. About 10 years after his death, our board went on retreat and said, let's see if we can distill in a few words what we think is the essence of that vision. And they came up with a beautiful guiding purpose statement that is our North Star. And I'll share it with you. It's our purpose: to awaken into and serve spirit, capital S, for the transformation of self and society, based on the principles of the wholeness of reality, freedom of spirit, and unconditional love, and the integration of the inner life of mind and spirit with the outer life of action and service. That gets me up every morning, just thinking, wow, what a blessing. And, you know, I'm guessing that that's a guiding purpose that pretty much a lot of you all can buy into. Can't tell you everything we do. Apropos the subject of this symposium, spirituality and science, the convergence of spirituality and science, tremendously important to John Fetzer. It manifests now in our work in one way, supporting scientists. We have an intensive program in quantum physics and consciousness that tries to open up our thinking about the fundamental nature of reality. We also support scientists like Richie and Lisa and Cliff Sarin, who you heard yesterday, on the search for scientific insights into human flourishing, to put it broadly. And that's tremendously important. But I'd also like to say we drop down to an even deeper level think about the challenge of bringing the scientific and spiritual ways of knowing into right relationship. We feel like as human beings, our most fundamental obligation is to try to tell the deepest and truest story about the nature of reality that we can, and then to bring our lives into our alignment with our understanding of reality. And so we have to use all the tools at our disposal, and those include our scientific and rational ways of knowing, but also our spiritual way of knowing. And our overall take is that that's gotten way out of balance, that in the post-Enlightenment West, we've privileged science and reason and lost the confidence of our spiritual intuitions, much to our detriment. Science, of course, has yielded tremendous benefits, but in the process, we've lost our sense of the sacredness of things. And so one way I focus that point is that thanks to science, we have become tremendously more powerful as a species, but we haven't become correspondingly more virtuous or wise or loving. And that's a story that ends badly because we will use that tremendous power destructively. So the great challenge for our generation is to inspire and support the growth of a powerful global movement that can bring that into balance by giving the world back the confidence of our spiritual nature, our innate goodness. And so we think in terms of doing our part to inspire and support that global movement. We think a lot about the need for the shared sacred story of humanity in the 21st century. It's a story that has to go all the way to the ground ontologically, and we think the exciting thing about what's happening in science is that there's tremendous opening now to think beyond the clockwork determinist universe that when you think about it doesn't have room for deep meaning, purpose, free will, or value, to a much more open possibility of consciousness as a fundamental constituent of reality, of meaning infused in the universe. I'd love to talk more about that. That indeed could be a whole festival of faith. But let me shift gears and offer some 3 observations about ways in which perhaps we as a community and a movement could go even further beyond this remarkable achievement of the last 25 years. And I want to build on our experience, or draw from our experience at Fetzer, and with real humility, but to share the thought that maybe we have learned some lessons the hard way that could benefit. The first is, how do we find and articulate that spiritual common ground? I mentioned our guiding purpose, awakening into and serving spirit for the transformation of self and society. Our board developed that back around 2000, but it lived on the margins of our community until the middle of 2013, when we said, if we're serious about that as our guiding purpose, we got to put it in the middle of our life as a community. So for the last 5.5 years, we've been gathering our staff of 60 every Tuesday morning for 3 hours to kind of live into the challenge of how do you do spirituality across difference? Because we're very diverse on lots of dimensions, including spiritual path. And I'll tell you, the first thing that happened when we started that is fear rushed into the middle of the circle, because people were saying, are you going to tell me what I have to believe about spirit? Are you going to judge whether I'm spiritual enough, whether my practice is deep enough? And we realized that we have to engage each other with the deepest humility and respect and love and gentleness, and also care about our language. Just a couple of things we ran into. Spirit, it's a word that's very congenial to me from the Christian tradition, but our Buddhist colleagues said, it has theistic overtones. We're not quite sure it works for us. From the other side, it was very congenial for them to talk about non-dual consciousness. And the Christians said, but no, the Trinity is very important for us, and that's the distinctness of persons is very important. And so I would just encourage us as a community to deepen that sense of humility and deep listening. Second thing I'd say is that if this global movement is going to be as big and as powerful as it needs to be, we need more people here. And particularly, I would say, we need to think about the importance of drawing into this interfaith conversation the more theologically conservative members of all of our traditions. This interfaith dialogue comes most naturally to folks that are in the spirit of many paths up one mountain. But many of the folks, people of deep faith, compassion, love, feel compelled to make some form of exclusivist claim for their tradition. We often pull back from them. But I would submit that the real challenge is to find a way to make common cause with them over against the nihilistic pull of so much of modern culture to affirm the deep sacredness of things, and to then share our experiences humbly. And the third and last seed I'd like to plant is one that is near and dear to me as a result of the work we've been doing since early 2016 under the flag of healing the heart of American democracy. And what I'll say there is we talked inappropriately about the urgency of the climate change problem. And the appeal was made multiple times that we need to make that our top priority. And I understand that. But I want to suggest for us as Americans, and this is true in many other places around the world, there's a prior challenge that we cannot skip over. And that is recognizing that our common life is breaking down. We have become so good at dehumanizing and even demonizing folks that we disagree with, that our common life is becoming polarized and toxic to a point that our very free society is at threat. And the truly sad thing, I think, for those of us in this room is that on too many days our faith communities have showed up as part of that polarizing dynamic. And why do I say that? In part because it's tearing us apart, but in part because it's a huge opportunity for those of us who believe in the profound importance of inner transformation. Because what I'm finding is that millions and millions of people are realizing that this is an existential threat, that there's no political solution, that it has to be addressed at the heart level. That is to say, they're ready for the spiritual conversation. And we need to step into that moment. And it's a real challenge because we have done an incredibly good job in this country with what some have described as the big sort, sorting ourselves out into ideologically homogeneous communities. And I want to humbly suggest that we've done it here. I won't ask for a show of hands, but I have great confidence that this community leans profoundly in the liberal direction. And we bring with that profound unconscious bias, and I will hazard to say, a dangerous degree of spiritual and intellectual arrogance. And if that shoe doesn't fit, don't wear it. But I run into it over and over, and I realize that I am at profound risk. We at Fetzer have realized there's a new dimension of diversity that we have to engage as a community, and that's ideological diversity. Fetzer has never been a place for an ideological conservative to be open about their views. So we're engaged in partnerships now with the Southern Baptist Convention, with the Charles Koch Institute, and I'll tell you what we are finding is that this same pull is working on that side as well, realizing that this hyper-partisan death spiral we're in can't continue. And what I'm finding is that when we step out courageously and humbly, we're met with equal courage and humility. So I have a vision of a bigger tent for this festival, bigger theologically and also bigger ideologically, so we can become the place where the really essential work of reconciliation and bridging and re-sanctifying the world can happen. And that, I think, is an inspiring vision. So I'll leave that with all of us to chew on. Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking out into the darkness towards Sarah. Do we have an interlude, a stretch break now? All right, stretch.
That was great, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you.
Feel the
Thank you.
deep connection.
Really beautiful.
Good. Well, you guys were fabulous.
You could feel the agreement.
All right, we're going to have just a very quick little video, but I just wanted to explain the significance of it. In 2013, at a festival of faith called Sacred Silence, a dream was born. And that dream was born between a meeting of a superintendent of the 19th largest public school system in the country, a Tibetan monk, and a visionary. And it was a magical alchemy that birthed this dream that we now refer to as the Compassionate Schools Project. And it has become such a substantial dream that there's even someone in our audience named Rosa Isabella from Medellin, Colombia, who came precisely to learn about the Compassionate Schools project. So for those of us who don't know that much about it, I thought we'd show a little clip on the genesis of the Compassionate Schools Project.
We all want what's best for our school children, but even our most effective school reforms haven't been able to break through the wall of certain persistent challenges. Cycles of disadvantage, depression, and anxiety have made many students resistant to these efforts. What can we try that we haven't already? Actually, a growing body of scientific evidence is showing that we can indeed address the effects of these cycles at school. And it's revealing something surprising. In order for these students to have an open mind for learning, they need something else first, an open heart. The practice of caring for themselves and others changes the way students think about the people around them and the tasks before them. Just practicing moments of respectful attention has shown a positive effect that can be measured. Most promising of all, teaching these skills and habits is not time-consuming or complicated. For this reason, individual schools around the country have begun to adopt classes in caring mindfulness, social and emotional learning, and body awareness. Available data show a significant effect on academic performance and sometimes a transformative one. This holds true for all students, including those who are already high achieving. So how do we bring these effective practices to every child in America, 90% of whom attend our public schools? Well, it would require a highly effective, easily adoptable curriculum that brings best practices together in an integrated way. It would require a gold standard study across a whole school district proving that the curriculum works and conforms to national and state standards. This is why I'm so excited to introduce you to the Compassionate Schools Project. The University of Virginia is leading the study in cooperation with the Jefferson County Public Schools in Louisville, Kentucky. The Compassionate Schools Project has the potential to change the course of education in this country, with a curriculum developed by national experts conforming to national standards that's easy for school districts to adopt and easy for schools to implement, breaking the cycles that negatively affect concentration, self-esteem, and resilience during the school day, helping students open their minds again by opening their hearts.
It is hard to imagine an initiative that would be more in the spirit of this conversation than Compassionate Schools. And I just want to congratulate everyone here in Louisville that has brought this into being. And just, I think it has the potential to be such an inspiring model for the country. And Richie, I know you've made a major contribution, so thank you. And we've don't have a lot of time left, but just like to invite, in whatever order you'd like to go, offering some further reflections around this theme.
Sure. Well, I had the great joy of visiting one of your Compassionate Schools within the past couple days, and indeed, the relational fabric was so strong. The capacity to see each child for much more than anything they've done or not done, anything they may have or not have, was very clear. And I saw right alongside a child for whom school is a snap and a child for whom school is a struggle, engaged in friendship with deep mutual respect, which came, of course, from the way they were beheld every day by the faculty. So Louisville has done an extraordinary job. I'm not surprised because I've found that you work very well together as a city and that people with enormous grace work together here very effectively. I think that the great work that has already been done is in many ways spiritually supportive. Mm-hmm. And we would be delighted to continue a conversation around deep spiritual support or support for the deep core of the child. Mm-hmm. I think what you're doing is extraordinary. Owsley, you have done something extraordinary. It's really remarkable. And it's a shining example of what's really possible citywide.
Well, thank you so much for being here and for this festival. One of the one of the convictions that I come away with is something that the Dalai Lama always reminds us of when we're with him, and that is 7 billion people, basically the same. And that basically the same is our spiritual core, or the awakened core, as you talk about it, Lisa, our innate basic goodness. And one of the really important things, though, is that we all share this, but we forget about it. We forget that this is our true nature. And so we all need to play a part in reminding ourselves and reminding others of this really extraordinary gift that every human being has, which is this gift of basic goodness, that we all share this same aspiration to be happy and to be free of suffering. And so to the extent that we can find strategies in our own life which work for us, and I'm a firm believer that each person needs to find his path, and that there is no one formula. But I think there is one basic nature, which is our awakened core, or our spiritual nature, our innate basic goodness. And if we are reminded of it on a regular basis, many times a day, I think we can all transform the world together. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. If I can believe the clock, we actually have a few minutes for a conversation. So reset the clock if it's not right. But I've got some questions I'd love to ask since we have a minute. And Richie, the first one goes back to the mandate you got from His Holiness to take the practices of the Buddhist tradition and make them available to a broad, inclusive audience. And it raises this question about what happens when you take practices that have grown up in a spiritual ground and a particular understanding of the nature of reality, and at least sever the explicit connection to that sacred ontology. I know you've reflected a lot on this. How do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's a really wonderful and important question. And the way I think about it is that there is a set of universal ethical principles which are really at the core of this. The Dalai Lama sometimes calls it secular ethics. I think the word secular, particularly in this context, has some unfortunate surplus meaning. I would prefer to call them universal ethics. And I think it's really important that whatever practices we teach in a way which is disseminated widely, practices that may be incorporated into public schools, for example, not lose connection with these universal ethical principles upon which the whole spiritual framework is based. And so one of the reasons why we don't use the word mindfulness so much in our own work is that there are people in our center who talk about McMindfulness and the commodification of mindfulness and how it has been so stripped of its spiritual core and has lost something in the process. And so I think we need to reconnect with that, but I think we can reconnect with it in a way which is acceptable to people of all faith traditions, as well as to those who are non-believers. But one of the other things the Dalai Lama frequently tells us is with the 7 billion people, 80% of the world's population self-identifies as being a member of a faith tradition. And so I think it's really important that whatever we do be a strategy which takes that into account.
Lisa, I mean, you grapple with the same challenge. anybody that's talking about taking spirituality into the public schools, given the First Amendment, necessarily grapples with that challenge.
Right.
How do you think about it?
So we've come up in my class at Columbia Teachers College with ways of speaking about spiritual life that are indeed constitutional and inclusive and reach a very wide and diverse range of students of all different faith traditions coming from all over the world. The first is very often we will meet and discuss in the first person meaningful spiritual experience with the realization that if I speak in the first person, it is my story, and everyone in the circle is invited to respond using their language in the first person. And in this way, through intimate discussion, we become spiritually multilingual, by which I mean your story can be told in the language and traditions of your lineage and touch my heart. And so too can my story touch your heart, that there's a deep way of knowing moved deep within us. Our natural spiritual capacity is touched by the language of all faith traditions when we can listen with our heart. Spiritual multilingualism could exist anywhere as long as we have a child-centered approach that honors the child's first-person voice. The other way we've handled this is to speak of meaningful, sacred, spiritual experience in the language of life. Can you speak about your higher self, the part of you that's much more than anything you've done or not done, have or not have? Can you speak about moments that were far too unprobabilistic to have happened by chance, which are miraculous? And the language of life is, of course, a sacred language. So that's another way we've handled this.
Yeah. Well, I see they have reset the clock, so we're, but still time for, one final thought, if you have one. Lisa, I'll just come back to you, and then I'll share one.
Well, my final reflection really is, Bob referred to this being a movement, and I think it very much is a movement, and it's going to require, I think, everyone to participate across a very broad spectrum of beliefs. And I do hold the conviction that in order for real transformation to occur, it's going to require some intentional practice. We know from neuroscience that there are two major forms of learning. One is called declarative learning, which is learning about stuff, and the other is procedural learning, which is embodied learning, skill-based learning, and these kinds of learning operate through different brain systems. We know we can sit a person down and teach them the value of honesty, but it will not make them an honest person. And so we need both forms of learning. Neither one is sufficient. Both are necessary for real change to occur. And our educational system has privileged declarative learning. And so we need to bring procedural learning in along with declarative learning. And procedural learning is about practice. And so let's all make a commitment to practice and nurture virtues in our mind and our body in ways that will, I think, transform the world. So thank you very much.
Lisa, you.
So something that we've shared here at this wonderful festival, and I'm so grateful to the festival leaders and organizers for the enormous amount of work to create this opportunity. We've seen here a sincere outward expression of our deep inner spiritual life. And I've found that when we speak authentically and tell our story at the level of spiritual reality, we give others permission to do the same. I think the greatest challenge in our society right now is that we are a spiritually non-conversant society. And we can change this in the next 3 minutes by simply bringing what we already have, which is our own inner life and our own personal way of expression, with great interest in how others do the same.
Thank you. Well, I'd just like to share the second half of a story I started in my comments about our community's struggle to find the language that we could all embrace as an articulation of our spiritual common ground. And I noted the problems with spirit and with non-dual consciousness. And so here's where we are now, and this is always subject to change. But we could all get together on this. We are drawn into community by our shared experience that there's more to reality than physical reality. And that something more binds us together in a deeply interconnected, meaningful, and sacred way, and calls us to a life of love and compassion. And that may, from a certain point of view, sound like a fairly minimalist thing that you can say, but actually when you reflect on it in the context of our current world, it's a very powerful place to come together. So I'm an optimist, and most fundamentally an optimist because 66 years of life experience have brought me to the firm conviction that love is more powerful than fear. Mm-hmm. And I think if we can carry that into the world courageously, the story ends well. So thank you all very much.